Thank you, Matt, for that introduction, and Andrea and you both for inviting us to share some of these insights we have gained from the grower survey we did in Hawaii a couple of years ago. So this is a joint work with my colleague David. So what we are going to do is I'm just going to go over some of the introduction of this study, and then just very brief descriptive of our farmer profile, and then hand it over to David, who will share the more detailed results and insights from the data we collected. We both are in the Agriculture, Food and Resource Economics department at Michigan State University, and both agricultural and applied economist. So, this is very briefly a reiteration of some of the facts that are perhaps known to all of you who are present here today. Coffee is an economically important crop in Hawaii. It's produced commercially by more than 1,400 growers. And since its first detection in 2020, coffee leaf rust has spread rapidly because the coffee genotypes that are currently grown in Hawaii are all susceptible to the disease. This disease, the CLR, if left untreated or poorly managed, can cause yield losses and can also lead to the fatality or the death of the tree. And so as a result, the impact of this disease, the CLR, on coffee farmers and their families and the whole community can be very devastating. So recognizing this, there was a rapid response from researchers and extension specialists to research and promote short-term and long-term strategies to manage the CLR. These strategies that they were promoting included all the things that rapidly unfolded after the disease was detected was the promotion of early detection and sanitation practices, the survey and monitoring of CLR, and using this data to craft IPM recommendations, and also testing and breeding resistant varieties. And each of these options, if you look closely, have implications on costs and benefits, which can vary by the grower type, by grower type in terms of the size of the land holding and whether and how much they use mechanization on their farm. So, whether and which type of coffee grower would adopt these strategies to manage the threat of CLR will depend on the economics of it. And so to better understand these economic issues, we conducted a survey of coffee growers under this USDA SCREE project that was awarded to SHAC and several partners that work on that project. The objectives of this survey was basically to gain insights on the spread of the CLR, just to understand how widespread this disease is on the island, its impact on coffee yield, the adoption of some of these different management strategies that were being promoted, what are the cost implications, and then challenges and outlook, sort of future outlook of the farmers, and also to understand farmers' willingness to adopt the CLR resistant varieties, which are sort of the long-term strategy and in the pipeline for something that Hawaii will have to deploy as a strategy to combat this disease. And then second, the objective was to understand how these experiences, responses, the strategies, their implications differed by the farm types and the farms that were mechanized versus those that were just partially mechanized, just the heterogeneity of those response strategies. So a little bit about the survey. The method that we used was an online survey where the link to the survey was sent through the coffee associations, listservs, and also the QR codes were shared at participants at major events and conferences. Towards the end, we also supplemented this online survey with the paper copy surveys that were distributed at the events to just increase the reach of the types of farmers that we could get to respond to these surveys, different types. And then our sample size ultimately that we got was about 87 responses through these different approaches. However, not all the online respondents completed the full survey. So we had several with missing data, especially towards the end of the survey, and because they were incomplete. And so at the end, we have about 68 fully completed surveys, about the 7 or so had completed at least 50%. So we considered that 68 plus 7 as sort of our analytical sample. And the timeline that was covered in this survey was from February 23 to October, or not the timeline covered in the survey, but the timeline, the time frame in which the survey was done was, it ran from February to October of 2023. So in terms of very quickly, a few slides on the sample profile. What are the characteristics of our sample? So in terms of the distribution of this 75 respondents from our survey, we categorize them in terms of the farm categories of those that use no mechanization, partial mechanization, and full mechanization. So our distribution of this 75 is in the first column, where it says about 42 respondents were fall under the no mechanization category, 33 had partial mechanization, and 1 full mechanization. Of course, because of anonymity and confidentiality issues, we are excluding that 1 observation of full mechanization because and anyways, in the whole population, there are only 3 such farms on the island. So we don't think there is a big loss in the value of the data that we are presenting, as most of our focus is on smallholder and those that have either no mechanization or partial mechanization, which are also on average about 2 to 20 acres of coffee farm size in our sample, and in population they're about 2 to 38 acres. In terms of percentage of our sample, they are more, about 56% of our sample was, no mechanization versus 96% in the population, and about 44% are partially mechanized versus 4% in the population. So that's sort of the comparison of our sample respondents versus the population of coffee growers in Hawaii. In terms of some of the characteristics of these farms, what we are going to do in throughout this presentation is we are going to present our findings in some of the 2 categories of farms: the no mechanization farms with no mechanization, and farms under partial mechanization. So in terms of our coffee growers that fall into these 2 categories, these are just a table of quickly some of the demographic characteristics and farm characteristics in terms of their age, how many were female owners, and the years of coffee growing experience they have, their education, membership in coffee associations, and whether the the business was a sole proprietary or no. Is another type of characteristics that we profile here includes, that partially their elevation and size in terms of their elevation. The partially mechanized farms are generally located at higher elevations with 64% above the 1400 meter above sea level, and compared to 43% of non-mechanized farms. The partially mechanized farms also significantly are larger in terms of acreage, 20 acres compared to non-mechanized that are just about 3 acres. In terms of tree density and age of the tree that they planted, the tree density is higher for partially mechanized farms of 633 trees per acre compared to the 523 for non-mechanized farms. The mean age of the coffee trees is also younger in partially mechanized farms compared to non-mechanized farms. These two farm categories also differ in terms of some of the farming practices. For example, a higher percentage of partially mechanized farms grow coffee with defined spacing between trees. And also intercropping is more common in non-mechanized than in partially mechanized farms. So basically, the non-mechanized farms have more characteristics of, what we call typically the smallholder farmers that have small land holding, do more intercropping, and practice less of some of the agronomic and tree spacing and those kind of recommendations. In terms of income and productivity, the partially mechanized, they also are different. Partially mechanized farms have much higher median and mean total farm income compared to non-mechanized farms. Again, this just follows from the smallholder farm characteristics where, coffee perhaps is not, at least for the partially mechanized, it's a major perhaps source of income than for the non-mechanized. The cherry production's contribution to farm income is also higher for partially mechanized, where it contributes almost 72% of their farm income compared to non-mechanized, where it's 63%. There is also, I'm sorry, this graph sort of highlights the various additional activities that coffee farms engage in beyond coffee production. And the range of these activities include selling roasted coffee, selling cherries, coffee processing, selling green coffee, roasting coffee, agrotourism, buying green coffee and cherries from other farmers, etc. And the key points to highlight here is that farms with partial mechanization, which is the light green color bars here, they are more involved in most of these activities compared to farms with no mechanization. The highest involvement of both types of farms is in retailing roasted coffee, selling cherries, and coffee processing. There is also significantly higher engagement in agrotourism and coffee processing among partially mechanized farms compared to non-mechanized farms. So that's sort of my introduction in terms of the study, what it is, why we did it, and some of the basic characteristics of our sample. So I'll hand it over now to David to give us the results in terms of CLR detection on farm and some of the cost and benefits side. So David, I will stop and then you can start sharing your screen.
Great, thanks, Mywish. Are you all seeing my screen? Mywish, can you give me a thumbs up? Is it clear?
Yes.
Full screen, correct? Great. Well,
Yes,
thanks,
it is.
Mywish. Just to pick it up from Mywish's introduction, just going to go through some of the results. We'll first look at sort of very quickly CLR detection, and then we will look at results in terms of the management practices that the various uh, coffee farms are implementing, and then we'll get into impacts of CLR, profitability, outlook, and then a little bit about um, their views on adoption of some of the CLR resistant varieties. So keep in mind that this was conducted, our survey was conducted back in 2023. And so here you can see the first year that CLR was detected on these farms. So by 2021, I would say the bulk, 21, 22, the majority of our sampled farms had detected CLR. And then again, as of 2023, roughly 40% of trees were estimated to have been infected with CLR in their last completed season. So I'm sure a much different picture right now, given that we conducted the survey back in 2023. When we look at adoption of management practices, we see that since the discovery of CLR in these farms, many of these operations have implemented prevention or monitoring management practices. That number is higher for the partially mechanized farms compared to the non-mechanized, where they've, between 71 and 90% had implemented some type of prevention or monitoring practice. On the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see that, the vast majority of these practices that they implemented include surveying and scouting of trees and monitoring for CLR on trees, as well as spraying hotspots of early CLR detection. At the time, very few sort of decontamination, best, sort of biosecurity practices that were being implemented by these farms. In terms of field sanitation practices that were used, since the discovery of CLR, the vast majority of these operations had implemented some type of field sanitation practices, things like increased weed control, as well as the increased level of pruning and desuckering of trees. And so, very, very little difference here between the mechanized or the partially mechanized and the non-mechanized farms. When it comes to tree nutrition practices that were used, we see that all of our partially mechanized farms had changed the tree nutrition practices compared to 86% of the non-mechanized. And you see here, what practices they implemented were, mixing HDOA approved pesticides in order to save money and time, increased application of granular fertilizer, and then as well as the increased frequency of approved fungicide spraying. On average, the number of CLR management practices that were implemented by the type of farm out of 15 that we looked into was higher for the partially mechanized farms compared to the non-mechanized farm. A lot of that, as Mywish has already alluded to, and you'll see in the coming results, has to do with labor costs that the non-mechanized farms face higher labor costs compared to the partially mechanized farms. In terms of the cost of CLR management, we see here that the total coffee growing and harvesting cost per acre, including CLR management costs, were significantly higher for the non-mechanized farms compared to the partially mechanized farms. So roughly $6,000 per acre for the non-mechanized farms compared to the partially mechanized farms at $5,000 per acre. The percent of the production and harvest cost that is devoted to CLR management is a little bit higher for the partially mechanized farm. But given the total cost, the CLR management cost per acre is higher for the non-mechanized farm. And that is because the percentage of the cost that's devoted to labor is significantly higher for the non-mechanized farms compared to the partially mechanized farms. So about 30% of the CLR management costs are devoted to labor for the non-mechanized operations compared to about 18% for the partially mechanized. So we're looking at between around $400 per acre that are devoted to labor costs for CLR management for non-mechanized versus, almost half of that for the partially mechanized. And then the costs that are devoted to fungicide and other materials, a little bit higher for the partially mechanized farms, but not too far off. And the number of times that farmers have to pass through each field to spray fungicides is a little bit higher for the non-mechanized farms as well. Activities that contributed to the CLR labor cost by farm type. So, tree nutrition efforts, fertilizer applications, fungicide spraying, as well as, for the non-mechanized farms, field sanitation practices, things like mulching, pruning, that was significantly higher for the non-mechanized farms. But also monitoring of CLR, was reported as a significant factor by over half of both partially mechanized and non-mechanized operations. In terms of the fungicides that are mostly used to control CLR that contributed to their management cost, I'm sure you all are familiar with these. You see here that Oxidate 2.0, Serenade, Coside, Priaxor are the ones that have been noted as being more expensive in terms of management cost by both partially mechanized and non-mechanized farms. Moving on to the economic impact of CLR. Here we have the estimated yield losses due to CLR infestation in pounds per acre by farm type. So as you can see, the cherry yield pre-CLR is higher for the partially mechanized farms. And then what we do is we ask, when we look at post CLR, the yield decreases. For the partially mechanized, we decrease from 3,800 pounds to about 2,600 pounds. And we ask in our survey what percentage of that loss is attributed to CLR. So again, keep in mind that this is an estimate. And it's roughly about the same for in terms of yield loss, about 687 pounds per acre. Now, when we look at the non-mechanized farm, they have lower yields pre-season, and then lower yield post-season. And so here you have sort of that breakdown of how much of the yield loss is due to CLR versus other potential reasons that they might have noted. So then what we do is we sort of take that data and we go to for the different types, and then we project that out using the number of acres from the National Ag Statistics Survey. And so we estimate that total estimated cherry production pre-CLR in the state of Hawaii was about 21 million pounds. Total estimated cherry production post-CLR, we're looking at 100 million pounds. And the total estimated self-reported cherry production, if there were no CLR, would have been about 13.8 million pounds. So we're looking at a loss of about 3.8 million pounds of cherry in 2023 that can be attributed to CLR infestation. And that represents about 18% of the pre-CLR production levels. Again, this is kind of a very rough estimate using our survey data that we collected for these two types of farm operations, the non-mechanized, partially mechanized, and we're just using that and projecting it out based on the number of acres that are reported by NASS. Now, when we get into gross margins, so here two things happen. So the top part of this table is pre-CLR, so when things were good. And then post-CLR is what you see in sort of the second panel. So two things happen. First is that yields went down and cost went up. And so you can see that the total revenue per acre for both types of farms decreases quite substantially. And just as a side note here, the cherry price was actually a little bit higher in the post CLR year than the pre CLR. But even so, we see a pretty significant decrease um, in revenue. You see a pretty significant increase in total cost per acre. That increase, as we've talked about, is significantly higher for the non-mechanized farms. So when we look at the gross margin, the non-mechanized farms are looking at a negative gross margin in terms of dollars per acre post CLR. Again, it's important to keep in mind that this was done pretty early. This is back in 2023. Um, Operations have adapted to the situation since then, but this is just a snapshot in time back in 2023. So we see that the net reductions in gross margins after CLR detection are significantly higher for the non-mechanized farms compared to the partially mechanized farms. In terms of challenges and outlook, here we have the reported top 3 challenges of managing CLR. And just keep in mind that a lower score here indicates that it's a more pressing challenge. So for I guess for both non-mechanized and partially mechanized, the biggest challenge of managing CLR is the high fungicide and input costs, followed by high labor costs, and also outside of the costs domain, we have the lack of available CLR resistant varieties, and for the partially mechanized farms, sort of lack of information on how to manage CLR. So the challenges span both costs, but also lack of CLR resistant varieties, and then also lack of information, at least as of 2023. We asked the farmers, coffee farmers, if CLR prevalence experienced in the most recently completed growing season were to continue, how they felt that their current management practices would keep their farm profitable. As you can see, there's a lot of, we asked in terms of this current year, next year, and then the horizon in the next 5 years. So over half felt that they could remain profitable the current year and into the next year. But as we get 5 years out, a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether they would be able to remain profitable given their current management practices. And that was sort of a very similar finding for the non-mechanized and the partially mechanized operations. In terms of their outlook on their farm's profitability to manage CLR in the years to come, fairly positive for the current year and then the following year. But when we look 5 years out, that's where we start to see sort of that uncertainty. And the positive outlook really sort of takes a dive, especially for the non-mechanized operations. In terms of their reasons for a positive outlook on CLR management, we see that for both types of operations, they believe that effective CLR management practices would be in place. Sort of one of the main reasons for that positive outlook, followed by their belief that some of the CLR resistant varieties would soon become available. When we look at the reasons for negative outlook, here we see the things that come to mind are cost of inputs continuing to go up, concerns, especially from the non-mechanized farms, that CLR would spread more quickly. And then for the partially mechanized farms, we see that there was concerns about labor costs going up, as well as labor shortage that would continue to affect them. When we look at their willingness to adopt CLR resistant varieties, we see that, by and large, producers are open to adapt to, replacing their current varieties with CLR resistant varieties. The number of or the percentage of no responses is less than 1/3. But we see that at least for the partially mechanized farms, they're very open and willing to sort of replace their current varieties, more so than the non-mechanized farms and operations. The reasons for those that are more hesitant in planting new CLR resistant varieties, costs obviously come up, but we see that there are concerns that the CLR resistant varieties may not be suitable with regards to the flavor profile for the agroecology of the state. And that was more of a concern for the partially mechanized operations. We also gauged farmers' willingness to pay for CLR resistant varieties. So here we have their willingness to pay in dollars per seedling per tree. We see that the median willingness to pay is going to be higher for the non-mechanized farm. Part of that has to do that they have smaller number of trees, but here we have sort of a demand curve in terms of the percent of farms that would be willing to pay for CLR resistant varieties. As the price drops, you can see that the number of farm increases. And then moving on to sort of the conclusions and main takeaways, first want to just acknowledge a couple limitations of our study. We have a relatively small sample size of farmers, which may not be fully representative of the, approximately 1,500 coffee growers in Hawaii. The study also relies on self-reported data that can be subject to recall bias, over-reporting or under-reporting of certain practices, as well as costs and issues with estimating yields. It's important to also keep in mind that our survey was conducted over several months between February and October of 2023, in which conditions and practices may have changed during that time, and so that could affect the consistency and comparability of the data collected, at different times. Main takeaways from our work is that CLR has a significant economic impact on coffee production in the state of Hawaii. It has caused substantial yield losses and has had a severe impact on the economic viability of coffee farming in Hawaii. Pre-CLR and post-CLR comparisons show a pretty significant reduction in cherry production, as well as gross margins per acre, indicating that the disease has significantly affected profitability. From a management strategy perspective, we've seen, and the data shows that various management strategies have been adopted, including early detection, sanitation, and fungicide application. But the cost of CLR management on a per acre basis is substantial, with labor and fungicide, the cost of the actual fungicide product being a significant component of the total cost. And when it comes to labor, it's particularly a challenge for the non-mechanized farms. In terms of willingness to adopt resistant varieties, there's mixed willingness to adopt, with hesitations primarily coming from the cost as well as the uncertainty over the suitability of some of these varieties and what their flavor profile would look like. And in some cases, there was, some satisfaction with the current management strategies. In terms of challenges and outlook, as I just went over briefly, the major challenges remain the high input costs, labor shortages, and some regulatory constraints, particularly when it comes to the type of fungicides and how they can be applied. And then the outlook really varies, with some growers showing optimism about future management and the availability of resistant varieties, but others are concerned about the ongoing high costs, again, the labor costs, input costs, as well as the spread of CLR. In terms of implications, there's really a need for financial support and incentives to help farmers adopt effective management strategies and resilient coffee varieties. You know, research and development, we need continued investments in R&D for developing and also disseminating these CLR resistant coffee varieties, and ensuring that these varieties are accessible and affordable for all types of growers. And that's really going to be key to the sustainability of the sector. You know, enhanced extension services, you know, it would benefit to sort of take the information on best management practices, um, and sort of disseminate that to farmers so that they can make more informed decisions and also optimize their management strategies. The situation has drastically changed from when we did the survey. And so, you know, it's important to provide farmers with timely and accurate information. And then just the need to address the labor shortage, and finding ways to reduce input costs is going to be really critical. You know, this is going to include trainings, incentives for potential mechanization, and also, you know, excuse me, potentially looking at subsidies for fungicides and other inputs to address those management costs. Couple last things on the policy and regulatory adjustments. Really important to revisit and potentially revise the regulatory framework to support CLR management and control, to create a more favorable environment for producers to adopt these necessary practices without increasing undue burden to them. And then you know, the last thing that I'll say here is just, you know, the need to have more of these types of events that foster collaboration among researchers, industry stakeholders, as well as producers, to really facilitate knowledge sharing and collective action, you know, against CLR. So with that, just want to thank you all for your attention, and we are happy to entertain any questions that you may have.